Matthew Offord.
Speaker, I'm very pleased to be called in this debate, but I do find it rather sad that we're still talking about this issue after so much time, particularly back in 2009 when DEFRA officials said that under the Animal Welfare Act the ban could be introduced. I think where we've gone wrong are the recent comments by the Minister who said that a total ban on wild animals in circuses might well be seen as a disproportionate action under the European Union Service Directive and under our own Human Rights Act 1998. Well, I have to say, I agree with the Honourable Member for Wrekin. Having had some contact with whips myself in the last week, I've become quite an expert on the Human Rights Act and particularly knowledgeable about Article 8. Having regard to the case law of the European Court, it is difficult to envisage a cogent argument that would support the assertion that a ban, other than rights under the Convention, such as a right to life, a fair trial and so on, could be engaged. Therefore, I can only presume the Minister in his comments said this when considering a ban under Article 8. Article 8.1 has been interpreted by the European Court extremely broadly, where exemptions or limitations to the right have been interpreted narrowly. The right has three potential relevant elements: private life, family life and home. Private life has been held to include the right to develop one's own personality in relationship with others. The European Court considered that the notion of personal autonomy is an important principle underlying the interpretation of the right. The right has, however, been held not to apply to activities which relate to the private aspects of a person's life, such as those which take place in public, where there is no exception of privacy. In the present situation, a ban does not relate to the private aspects of the lives of those potentially affected. It relates to their employment, which essentially takes place in public and without the expectation of privacy. Equally, the ban does not affect the right to a family life in that it does not prevent or interfere with a person living in proximity to their family. Finally, the concept of a home under the Convention is a wide one and would include travelling accommodation used as well as permanent dwellings. I will, Minister.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for giving way. I'm sure he's right about Article 8 of the Human Rights Act, but at no time have I ever referred to Article 8 of the Human Rights Act. If he actually read what I said, I referred to Article 1.
I stand corrected. I'm very happy to stand corrected by the Minister, and that allows me to move my argument on then, that a ban on animals also wouldn't be, in circuses, would be capable of interfering with a person's right to peaceful enjoyment of their possessions, because it would amount to a control on how these possessions may be used. However, such an interference with the right will not violate the right if it is done in the public interest. Therefore, I will urge the Minister if he will consider a ban in that public interest. The European courts have decided that whether or not the control on possessions imposed by a ban is in the public interest, they will have regard to whether or not the ban represents a fair balance between the needs of the public interest and the rights of the individual. In other words, Minister, the European Court will consider whether a total ban is a proportionate measure to achieve the public interest aim in question. Accordingly, it is important to consider why exactly a ban is required in the public interest. If the total ban was proposed to ensure that animals were kept in appropriate conditions and cared for by appropriately qualified persons, there is an argument that a ban is not proportionate to the public interest aim being pursued, such as licensing and inspection regime which has been proposed. However, if a total ban is proposed because it's considered cruel or ethically wrong itself to make wild animals perform in circuses in the UK, then a total ban is the only measure which would achieve this public aim. Accordingly, if Parliament determines that wild animals performing in circuses are no longer acceptable to the public, it would therefore be in the public interest to have a ban on the use of such animals. The European Court would be very unlikely to question the judgment of this House as to what is in the public interest of the United Kingdom. Yes, I will give way.
I thank my friend for giving way. Is he aware that in the UK over 200 local authorities have bans on animals in circuses? More than two-thirds of these bans on all performing animals, the remainder ban wild animals. Is he aware of any court cases at the moment under human rights legislation?
I'm certainly not aware of any cases under the human rights legislation, but I will inform my honourable friend that it's not just 200 local authorities. Of course, it's countries and principalities in countries including Austria, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Greece, Hungary, Ireland, Poland, Portugal, Spain and Sweden. All these countries have decided to take this approach, yet we are once again kowtowing down to the European courts.
Would like,
I will.
just on the human rights point, does he accept that it only takes one person to challenge this particular decision to delay the process that everybody in the House seems to want for a number of years, whereas sensible regulation can achieve the same aims over a much shorter time?
What I would suggest, as others have already urged, is that we take a lead upon this matter. As I said, I've had some experience with the Human Rights Act this week, and I have to say, when people come along with it, many in officialdom cow down and decide that suddenly that it's a very important issue and you will get away with what you were trying to achieve. In summary, though, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will say that the case law of the European Court of Human Rights indicates that a ban will be within the margin of appreciation afforded to the United Kingdom. Secondly, if a ban is proposed because it is considered cruel or ethically wrong in itself to make wild animals perform in circuses in the UK, as opposed to a ban proposed because welfare standards cannot be guaranteed, then a ban is the only measure which will achieve this public interest aim and is therefore automatically proportionate. Accordingly, a ban would not breach the Convention, and as a ban is the only control on the use of wild animals in circuses and therefore does not deprive the owner of the animal itself or the ability to use it for commercial purposes, there is a strong presumption against compensation being awarded to persons who have suffered any loss as a result of the ban. If the government decides to go along and implement a ban, I do not believe it would be as revolutionary as we have heard today with the 200 local authorities and also other countries. I personally don't believe that animals should be subjected to the conditions of circus life. Regular transport, cramped and bare temporary housing, forced training and performance, loud noises and crowds of people are all often typical and unavoidable realities for the animals. Therefore, unless the government can give us a time frame for a ban of animals in circuses, I will be voting for the amendment.
Neil Griffiths.
Indeed, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Well, certainly, we've heard many comments already from many of our colleagues, so I'm not going to repeat some of the things that have already been said, but I rise in support of the motion that we're debating today, which directs the government to use its power under Section 12 of the Animal Welfare Act 2006 to introduce a regulation banning the use of all wild animals in circuses. I actually had the privilege of serving on the committee back in 2006 on that animal welfare bill, which is an excellent act and has brought forward many, many good aspects in terms of asking people to think very carefully, introducing codes and saying this issue really matters, animal welfare really matters. But I have got to say that during the process of that committee, I actually raised the issue of banning the use of wild animals in circuses, and I would have liked to have seen a much slicker process there in the bill at that time in order to progress the matter. However, things have progressed. It is absolutely clear from the consultation that the Labour government instigated in 2009 that public opinion is very clearly behind us now. We know that even more than we did back in 2006, with 94.5% of the public actually saying quite clearly they would support a ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. It was therefore a great shame that we did not have the time to introduce that ban before the election, and that the coalition government chose to disregard that public opinion and not proceed forward with introducing the ban. It is extraordinary that we have had the smokescreen of the European Union put up as an excuse for not having the ban, because quite clearly, as has been explained earlier on, the Commission has clarified the position and there is absolutely no obstacle whatsoever to us introducing the ban.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and she is indeed to be commended for the work that she's done on animal welfare in the last Parliament and in this one. But isn't it also the case that actually secondary legislation is all that is required to bring in this ban, using the provisions already in the Animal Welfare Act? So it's actually a very simple process to do.
Well, indeed, my honourable friend has clarified the position that that is indeed the case, that it is very straightforward. It can be done because of the groundwork that was done in the Animal Welfare Bill when it was brought forward in its first stages. So, we are not prevented by the European Union. There is clearly evidence from local councils over many, many years that where given the opportunity, many local councils have tried to ban the not the use of animals in circuses, but the fact that the circuses are not allowed to come onto their land to perform, because they want to make the point clear, and they're obviously responding to the public. But we don't want a messy situation of licensing where this, that and the other has to be done, and the situation is unclear to everybody. We want a simple, straightforward ban.
Giving way, and I'm sure that throughout this debate there will be no doubt party political points to be scored, but does she not accept there is actually a gathering consensus and certainly an indication from the government in terms of their own body language leading up to this debate, and I congratulate those who've called it, that in fact the government's position since the announcement on the 13th of May is indicating that there is a growing preference and clarity that there is a preference in government for a ban?
Well, I think what we want to see today is we want to see a definitive decision taken, and we want to see that decision, quite frankly, going in favour of a ban, and we want to see that ban implemented without any further delays of any sort whatsoever, because it's so clear from the consultation that's been held, it's so clear where public opinion is now, and it's so clear the reasons why. I'm not going to list again and again some of the terrible instances of cruelty that we've heard about, but even if there were no deliberate cruelty, it is quite clear to anybody that the lifestyle of hopping in and out of a cage and performing and travelling and performing and travelling is not something that anybody could possibly understand as the way that a wild animal would be expected to behave. And the business about 10 generations, even your own cats and dogs who may be 10 generations domesticated, you have cat flaps, you take dogs for walks, you certainly do not expect them to live the life of hopping in and out of a cage and being isolated from other members of their own species, being isolated from taken right out of their environment. It's clearly incompatible. And if you think now of the opportunities that we have, if we think of the opportunities that we have for young people to see how animals can live in the wild, you can have the hidden cameras, you can have the experts, the naturalists who produce these fabulous films, you can click on your computer, you can see all of this, you can actually go to a safari park for some animals who can be kept in certain ways in this country without having to travel abroad.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Is it not the case that as a society we have come to expect that animals will live in their natural environment and that we don't expect them to survive and live for the benefit of human beings and their entertainment?
Well, absolutely. It is purely a selfish idea that anybody would want to see an animal perform in a circus. As my honourable friend has quite rightly pointed out, we have moved on from that. It is completely medieval to think that we are going back to the idea that you take an animal around on a chain because perhaps nobody in the area in the country has had a chance ever to see that type of animal. Well, that is medieval. We don't want that anymore. We know that there are many important lessons that we want to teach our young people, and the very fundamental lesson about the respect and treating animals properly and well is not going to be learnt if they're taken to a circus to see the sort of antics, and to have to understand that in order to see that they would have had travelling and all sorts of very undesirable practices which, you know, make it the animal welfare absolutely incompatible with the life of a travelling circus. So, very quickly.
Be quick. I just want to say that I personally have had personal experience of wild animal. I found a bear in a cage in no man's land. He had been left there for 4 weeks without water. He was entirely miserable, wouldn't even be coaxed out of his cage by honey. We managed to ethnically cleanse that bear out of Bosnia, into Croatia, and then he's now a very happy bear. And I only put this out because, quite frankly, he's now in Amsterdam Zoo and full of life, and it's great. And I fully support the idea of banning animals in cages. It would stop that sort of thing.
As I say, we have moved on. Society has moved on. We certainly do not expect to see the cruelty of having animals in circuses in this day and age. And so what we would like to see now is the most efficient way to to get this ban sorted out for the whole country, not in little bits and pieces, not in half measures, but a proper ban, so that we have a proper ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. As we've said, there are so many other ways in which young people can be educated and they can learn about animals. They do not need to see the cruelty of the animal in the circus. And so I would like to fully support the motion and congratulate the members who brought it today and thank the Backbench Committee for allowing this debate.
John Leach. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak in what's an incredibly important motion, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for the Wrekin for securing this important debate. I think it would probably be right to say that I don't always agree with the Honourable Member for the Wrekin, but I do recognise his strong commitment to issues of animal welfare, and I certainly share that commitment. Honourable members have already actually had the opportunity to debate this issue of banning wild animals in circuses in a Westminster Hall debate secured by the Honourable Member for Stoke-on-Trent South on the 8th of June. I'm delighted that we now have the opportunity for a debate and vote on this important issue on the floor of the House this afternoon. I would like to begin by making it very clear that I will be voting for this motion this afternoon. There have been suggestions that perhaps Conservative backbench MPs were or are or have been at some point today whipped to vote against this motion, and I'd like to state categorically that I've not been whipped by any Liberal Democrat member to vote either way on this backbench business. And
to be liberated already.
All I would like to say to Conservative colleagues who may be thinking of voting against this motion this afternoon is just to bear in mind the level of public support throughout the country, but more specifically in their own constituencies, for a total ban on the use of wild animals in circuses. My real concern, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the action proposed by the government to introduce a licensing scheme may inadvertently legitimise the use of wild animals in circuses and result in an increase in the use of wild animals and therefore an increase in suffering. Over a number of years, we've seen a dramatic... I will give one.
Should the honourable gentleman given way? And isn't the problem with licensing as well is that it doesn't deal with the issue of welfare of animals, because animals will still be travelling about and still kept in unacceptable conditions. So licensing doesn't actually tackle the issue of animal welfare.
I thank the honourable member for giving way, and I'm just about to make that very point. Over the last few years, there's been a dramatic reduction in the number of wild animals in circuses, and I now think there are only around 38, 39 animals being used in 3 circuses. This has been a welcome decline in the use of wild animals in circuses. I would hope that this trend would continue as more and more people support a complete ban. Recent surveys have suggested that at least 70% of people support a complete ban, and in response to the consultation, over 94% of people who responded to the consultation supported an outright ban. Unfortunately, I understand from CAPS, the Captive Animals Protection Society, that the day after the Westminster Hall debate, Malcolm Clay, the Secretary of the Association of Circus Proprietors of Great Britain, suggested that far from a licensing scheme discouraging circuses from using wild animals, which the Minister suggested might be the case, that instead, and I quote, "Once we have regulation which reassures the public, we may see some circuses return to using animals." Surely this is not the intention of the Minister. Mr Deputy Speaker, the issue of wild animals in circuses has been in the public focus in recent times, not least because of the spotlight on the poor treatment of Anne the elephant, but also due to people watching the film Water for Elephants at the cinema, and I would urge honourable members who haven't seen it to go and see that film. Unfortunately, to a certain extent, the plight of Anne the elephant has muddied the waters. I don't think anyone would disagree that no one with a brain would condone the mistreatment of animals. And I've no doubt that this incident is one of only a very small number of instances of animal cruelty in circuses. I've no doubt that the vast majority of wild animals in circuses are looked after as well as they possibly can be. But my concern is that the nature of a circus, moving from place to place in cramped conditions, makes it simply impossible to provide a suitable living environment for wild animals. The nature of the circus also makes it impossible to provide an inspection system that would be able to adequately check that regulations are being adhered to at every location without the inspection system being ridiculously expensive. While the Minister has said that the cost will fall upon the circuses, I suspect that it will probably result in an inadequate inspection system and an insufficient number of inspections. So in conclusion, Mr Deputy Speaker, an inspection system won't work and in fact might result in more wild animals in circuses and more suffering. It won't address the fact that the constant movement of animals in cramped conditions is not good for the welfare of the animals. The only way to absolutely ensure an end to animal suffering in circuses is a complete ban. And so I would urge honourable members on all sides of the House to vote for that ban.
To protect backbenchers getting an opportunity to participate in the debate, I'm reducing the time limit to 5 minutes. Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. And first, let me pay tribute to the honourable members who have brought this very important motion to be debated this afternoon. Mr Deputy Speaker, we need a ban on wild animals because keeping animals in circuses is cruel. But we also need a ban because the welfare of these animals is emblematic of the way we treat all animals and is symbolic of the kind of society that we live in today. The government's suggestion that the EU is somehow preventing us from moving on the issue of wild animals in circuses is wrong. In response to the insistence of ministers during the last debate on this subject that a legal threat in Europe has been a major factor in preventing an outright ban, a meeting was called by leading animal protection organisations with the European Commission's head of representation. And here it was confirmed once again that the issue of wild animals in circuses is a matter best left to the judgment of member states. And when I was a member of the European Parliament, we did a great deal of work trying to progress animal welfare issues in the European Parliament. And in many instances, the advice was to go back to member states in the first instance and to rouse them to act. I've therefore urged ministers to look, for example, at the action that was taken first on dog and cat fur and then on seal fur. On both occasions, it was leadership by member states that prompted the EU to go ahead with bans on those types of imports of fur. And it's significant that at that time, the legal advice was used to try and stop these bans was again that there were so-called outstanding legal impediments. Exactly the same excuse that's being used today. Governments were giving legal advice saying that it would be impossible to ban the import of cat and dog fur, and the same was said of seal fur. And yet, when individual governments challenged that dubious legal advice, they were able to make those bans happen. It is precisely when a number of forward-thinking member states are calling very strongly for action on something that we get progress on the EU position. There are clear precedents, not least in animal welfare policy, where action by individual member states is the means by which animal protection welfare is secured across the EU. Now, in an attempt to find out if the government was genuinely looking for a legal way to make a ban on animals in wild circuses happen, I asked a written question on whether the Secretary of State had received any legal advice on instances where a single EU member state had taken unilateral action on animal welfare matters, which subsequently had led to a change of EU policy in line with that action. And the extraordinarily complacent response was that the Secretary of State had no recollection of any such advice. But why isn't the Secretary of State actually going out and asking for it? Why isn't she looking for the legal means to go ahead with a ban in line with the wishes of the vast majority of people in this country? Instead, she and her ministers have been looking for legal cases to cower behind as a cover for not acting. And it's worth reminding ourselves that it isn't just because of public opinion that we need a ban, important though that is. People have spoken earlier about the importance of science, and I cited the evidence from the British Veterinary Association, which said, as I said, the welfare needs of non-domesticated wild animals cannot be met within the environment of a travelling circus, especially in terms of accommodation and the ability to express normal behaviour. A licensing scheme will not address these issues. So we're not here criticising individual circus owners. What we're saying is that the very nature of being in a circus means that the welfare needs of those animals cannot be addressed. Now, at first, my feeling was that the government's position on this issue was extraordinarily cowardly. As these debates continue, I'm sadly coming to the conclusion that the government doesn't want to act because they don't like to be seen to be banning things, and it's therefore looking for excuses.
But it is interesting to reflect that, successive UK governments have been in breach of their obligations under the Bathing Water Directive since 1975. And although it is very nice to see DEFRA suddenly having discovered the idea of complying in full with what it perceives to be its EU obligations, perhaps it's not too cynical to suggest that on this occasion they simply don't want to act. If they wanted to stop this cruel practice, the government would be acting, and in defence we'd be hearing about another Euro sausage type story, with headlines about the UK having every right to act, and how dare the EU interfere, as we saw with the Defend the British Bangor story. And yet in this instance the EU is not telling us what to do, but we instead are inventing barriers when none exist. I will.
She's making a marvellous speech. It's my understanding that every case brought by the European circus owners has actually, every legal case that has been brought, as has been mentioned in Austria, has actually been lost. So there seems to be almost no real basis for this claim that the government are making at all on this.
Absolutely.
Thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and I think it's a very helpful one to point out just that this really is a smokescreen that the government's hiding behind. And indeed the head of representation from the European Commission here in London recently wrote a letter to the Captive Animals Protection Society stating very plainly, yet again, that the EU considers that, and I quote, the welfare of animals is a matter best left to the judgment of member states. It is not acceptable to have a policy which leaves us just hoping that regulations will have the same effect as a ban, particularly given that the Secretary of the Association of Circus Proprietors of Great Britain stated on the very day after the last debate that he didn't believe the new costs of regulations would discourage circuses from having performing animals. Instead, he stated, once we have robust regulation which reassures the public, we may see some circuses returning to using animals. Now, how perverse would that be as an outcome from having licences?
The avoidance of doubt, can she just be clear? The EU haven't just said that these issues are best left to member states. The Commissioner has specifically said that they are the responsibility of the member states. That's what gives us the legitimacy to have a ban and to have it now.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for his intervention, and absolutely right. It is the responsibility for the member states to act. It is within our remit to act. It is right for us to act. That is what they are saying, and so it is incredibly perverse to try to do otherwise. So, in conclusion, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the government's judgment on this matter is woefully lacking. They've got it wrong on this one. I call on them to respect the wishes.
I'm sorry to intervene on the member towards the end of her speech, and thank her for doing so. But would she not expect, along with me, that if the vote goes through tonight in favour of a ban, that the government should act on that as soon as possible and bring a ban in as quickly as possible?
I thank the Honourable Member for her intervention, and I think were the government not to act in that way, the great British public would be very, very shocked indeed, and any sense of democratic accountability would be absolutely undermined. So I completely agree with her that the government should respect the wishes of the vast majority of people in this country, immediately ban the cruel practice of keeping wild animals in circuses. Personally, I would go further and ban all animals in circuses, not just the wild animals, and I would refer honourable members to the Cirque du Soleil, one of the most famous and successful circuses in all of Europe, where no animals are used whatsoever. So the outcome that the government implies that they want is for there to be no wild animals in circuses. If that is the case, then I call on them to show some real leadership and effect a ban now.
Zac Goldsmith.
Very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to pay my respects to the honourable member for the Wrekin, who I can't see, but congratulations to him for securing this very important debate. I'd also like to just put on the record that I'm grateful that this is now a free vote. I think to have applied a three-line whip to an issue like this would have made a mockery, actually, of the relationship between Parliament and government. So I think it's a welcome move over the last couple of hours. Now, I'm not going to pretend this is the biggest animal welfare issue, because it clearly isn't. There are 30 or 40 wild animals in circuses in this country, and that doesn't compare to the millions of animals that have to experience daily the brutality, the horrors of factory farming. But it is an important issue. There is no justifiable reason for keeping animals like elephants, tigers, lions and so on in small travelling cages away from any semblance of what for them would be a normal life. It's just not civilised in any way at all. And until recently, my understanding is the government took the same view, and that changed somewhere along the line. It's very hard for me, and I think many others, to understand why that happened. For one thing, the vast majority of people support a ban, and all the polls have suggested that. The public appetite for this kind of entertainment is, at worst, is fading. It's certainly not a growth sector, certainly not an important part of the... I certainly will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way on that specific point. With overwhelming public support against the use of animals, might this not actually help circuses, as it would actually potentially attract back those customers who, like me, are appalled by the use of wild animals?
I think that is actually an extremely valuable point. I have been to circuses in this country, and I've made the point of choosing to go only to those circuses when I know that they don't use wild animals, and it would be nice not to have to do that research. I'm sure a lot of people are repelled for that reason. I certainly will.
General public, MPs and even the ministers on the front bench here are opposed to continuation of allowing live animals in circuses to continue. Isn't it clear that the only person that's blocking this is the Prime Minister?
I don't know the politics. I have no idea what the Prime Minister's position is. But I do accept that the vast majority of the public are opposed. I believe that the vast majority of members in this House are opposed to the use of wild animals in circuses. And what's, I think, particularly confusing is that whereas the government has a stated ambition over the course of this Parliament to reduce red tape and bureaucracy, the alternative, can I just finish this point, the alternative that has been put forward to a very straightforward ban affecting 30, maybe 40 animals, is to construct a whole new regulatory regime with licensing and inspections and all the various costs associated with that, which I think goes absolutely against the general thrust of the direction in which this government is going, and all for 30 or 40 animals. It just doesn't make any sense at all. I'll give way.
I agree with the honourable gentleman about the strength of public opinion there. Well, therefore, why was it that his government and his Prime Minister were prepared to whip, on a three-line whip, his party against this bill until the member for Wrekin stood up?
I began by welcoming the change of heart over the last couple of years. I have not been part of that process, so I can't answer that question, but I'm very, very pleased that it is. I'm very pleased that this is a free vote. It's the kind of issue that should be a free vote. Had it been a three-line whip, I was very much on the record before the debate that I would have defied that whip and voted for this motion, as I think a very large number of people on this side of the chamber would have done, which perhaps is one of the reasons why it's not a free vote now. But the most disturbing aspect of the change of position taken by the government is that I don't think it's based on any kind of change of heart. As has been pointed out by a number of members, the only reason we've been given is that the government fears a possible legal challenge sometime in the future, possibly by the EU. To quote to one of the ministers, who quoted in The Independent today, I think, a total ban on wild animals in circuses might well be seen as disproportionate action under the European Union Services Directive and under our own Human Rights Act. Well, if that's true, it's hard to imagine anything more embarrassing, frankly, for this House. What the government is saying is effectively, even though it wants to do this very minor thing, even though the public would support such a move, it can't because it no longer has the authority to do so. Well, what does that say about Parliament? What does it say about democracy? What does it say about this country? Let me put it another way. What is the point of making promises up and down the country in the run-up to an election on the campaign trail if we no longer have the authority to fulfill even the most basic promise? It just makes a mockery of parliamentary democracy in this country. I certainly will.
On that very point, I'm sure he will recall that there was the issue of prisoners voting. And we were told then that the European Union and the European Courts of Human Rights particularly wouldn't allow us to do that. But I was very pleased that we had the opportunity, and members, particularly on this side of the House, showed the will of this Parliament. And this is just another example when we can show our own will again.
Absolutely accept the point made, and there are other examples too. We had a debate a month ago on fish discards, and this House unanimously passed a resolution requiring that the government veto any reforms to the CFP unless they include our reasserting control over the 12 miles around our coast. Now, it remains to be seen whether we have the will, the strength to do that. I very much hope we will. It remains to be seen, just as the issue of prisoner votes. I think in this case, the legal advice is at best ambiguous, and I'm convinced by the arguments used by a number of speakers that actually there is no genuine threat at all, that this is something the government could do and must do. So I'm going to back this motion, Mr. Speaker, and I hope colleagues will do the same. If not for the wild animals themselves, then simply to send a message to the public that this Parliament exists, and it exists for a purpose. Thank you.
Cathy Jameson.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and for once I should say, perhaps, it may be the only time, it's a pleasure for me to follow the Honourable Member for Richmond Park. I suspect that there may be many occasions in which we don't agree, but on this occasion we certainly do. And I want to just make a very short contribution in this debate, because I do think it's important that this House is seen to be reflecting public opinion and the views of our constituents. And like other honourable members, I have many, many constituents who care passionately about animal welfare issues. They don't see it as some kind of political agenda that they are running for their own sake, or to get themselves into a position, but they do genuinely believe in what they argue. And I want to pay particular tribute to one of my constituents, Maureen Rankin from Kilmarnock, who has done a huge amount of work over the years on this particular issue in relation to wild animals in circuses. And I'm actually quite glad that the tone of the debate has kind of moved on from what I think was a fairly sparky beginning to now begin to look at where there is consensus across the House and across the political parties. And I think that on an issue like this, that is what the public are actually looking for. There will be times when we disagree, there will be nuances and differences, of course.
Now, my honourable friend will be well aware that the Labour government gave a free vote on tail docking, and would she not agree that her constituent would expect there to be an automatic free vote on an issue of this importance, which is cross-party rather than party political?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I certainly was very glad to hear that during the course of the debate this afternoon, the government side has decided to offer a free vote, because I think that gives the opportunity for members genuinely to reflect the views of their constituents when we come to the end of this afternoon. I think the arguments for the ban have been very well rehearsed during the course of the debate, and I don't want to go over all of them again. I think it is very important to recognise that the arguments that are being made by organisations like One Kind, like Animal Defenders International, like the Born Free Foundation, arise out of a growing view over the years that it is no longer acceptable for animals to be used for this particular form of entertainment in circuses. And certainly I, for one, after many years in politics, albeit in another parliament, I'm quite glad to be with the 95% of the public on an issue, rather than trying to have to go out there and change opinion and argue a case, as I was on this particular issue when I first came into politics. Now, it's been mentioned already that a number of local authorities, including in Scotland, have already taken the view that they would not allow circuses with wild animals. Indeed.
Just on that point, would the Honourable Lady agree with me that despite some of the doom and gloom that there was, certainly in my city, when we took the step to do this, probably 20 years ago, people said, well, that will be the end of circuses in the city, but we've actually seen some superb circuses on an annual basis ever since.
My honourable friend makes a very powerful point that indeed Edinburgh, there are councils, Fife, and indeed in my own local authority area in East Ayrshire, where again there was cross-party support to take the view that circuses with wild animals should not be allowed onto council land. However, those local authorities, particularly in Scotland that I am aware of, also want to see moves going further to ensure that not only would they not allow circuses onto their land, but that there would not be situations where circuses with wild animals were able to come in to other locations within the council area. And there was also mention made in the opening speech in relation to the Scottish Government's position, and it is my understanding that certainly the new Scottish Government do take a sympathetic view to the issue of a ban. However, when I questioned the previous Scottish Government on their position at that stage last year, they were at that time awaiting the results of the DEFRA consultation, and I do think it would send a very powerful message, not just to England and Wales if today we were able to secure this vote, but I do think it would be helpful to those colleagues who are in the Scottish Parliament who want to see a ban enacted there. If we were for once to be able to take the lead on this issue, I will do.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. She may be aware that colleagues of mine have also tabled a motion in the Northern Ireland Assembly to lead off this debate about banning of wild animals in circuses there. But again, the Minister, when I've corresponded with the Minister for the Department of Agriculture, has said they're very much looking to DEFRA to take a lead on the issue and establish the principle.
Again, the Honourable Member makes a very valid point that the devolved administrations, of course, do have the powers and they can use those powers. But on an issue like this, where there are going to be important issues for across the UK, I think it is important that the DEFRA ministers are able to show some leadership and to move on this. Now, I understand that the Minister may well be in a very difficult position. It is always difficult as a Minister if you have strongly held personal views and perhaps the advice that you're receiving, legal advice or advice from others in your department or from civil servants or indeed from higher up, your political party does not correspond with that. But I do think that today the strength of feeling that has been shown across this House would, I hope, give the Minister the opportunity to come forward with something in his winding up speech to give us some hope that the government may be able to move on this if this vote is passed this afternoon. Certainly that's what my constituents who have been writing to me all week expect to do. We have a consensus, I think, building in the public's mind. That is certainly there, and I think this afternoon it is time for this House to show a consensual approach and come voting time ensure that that vote is registered in support of public opinion, in support of the organisations who have campaigned over many years, and most of all in support of the animals who otherwise will continue to be at risk.
Right. As the House can see, there's still several members trying to get in, and the wind-ups are going to start at past. So if members could show time constraint and actually reduce it themselves from the 5 minutes to maybe 3.5 minutes, then everybody perhaps will get in. Cheryl Murray.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'll try to be brief. I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for the Wrekin for calling